Ruby realized she might be pregnant when she ran into the bathroom for the third time, feeling nauseous but unable to vomit. The churning sensation in her stomach grew more severe, and she went to the water dispenser to get a cup of warm water to rinse her mouth, slowly suppressing the intense nausea. As she sat at her desk, she pondered what she had eaten that day, but everything seemed to be the usual food with no spicy or cold items. However, her usually punctual period was now a week late. Brandon had been talking a lot lately about wanting a child, and their contraceptive measures were inconsistent. Ruby's hand moved slowly to her lower abdomen as she calculated the timing, realizing the likelihood of pregnancy was increasing. Ruby felt conflicted. While the timing for having a child seemed right given their ages and Brandon's stable business, she hadn't started taking folic acid in advance. Brandon had also been attending business socials where alcohol was involved. If she was indeed pregnant, it felt a bit sudden for her. After work that day, she bought a pregnancy test, and the next morning, she confirmed it with 2 positive lines. After some thought, she took a day off, went to the hospital for a blood test, and had some imaging done to confirm the pregnancy. The doctor, upon hearing about the severity and frequency of her morning sickness, advised her, "Your reaction is a bit strong. Although there's nothing major, you should still be mindful." It wasn't until the next day, when Brandon returned from his business trip, that Ruby shared the news of her pregnancy. The 28-year-old matured man was overjoyed, hugging Ruby and spinning her around. He was so excited that his words became a bit incoherent, insisting on taking her out for a celebratory dinner. Ruby chuckled, and before she could say anything, she saw him regretfully hitting his own head. Suddenly, "I feel like the outside food might not be hygienic." "Oh well, forget it. I'll cook for you." So, without changing out of his travel clothes, Brandon insisted on taking Ruby to the supermarket to choose ingredients together. On the way, sitting in the passenger seat, Ruby seemed to suddenly realize, looking at her own abdomen, that they now shared a life. Connected by blood, the fruition of their union. A strange and wonderful feeling, Ruby thought. Just the day before, she felt unprepared for the arrival of this child, and today, she was already filled with joy. "The sun is shining brightly today," Brandon said with a smile as he opened the car door for Ruby when they arrived at their destination. She paused for a moment, feeling like she had heard this phrase before. The not-so-harsh sunlight illuminated Brandon's face, and Ruby shook herself out of her thoughts, as if transported back to their first conversation. "Today's sunshine is quite nice," a crisp yet slightly lazy male voice came from the back seat to her left. It was the first class on Thursday morning in the second semester of the sophomore year, originally scheduled for physical education. She had taken leave due to a twisted ankle, leaving only the 2 of them in the empty classroom. Having just finished the second essay on the Chinese test paper, she was examining the reasons for a wrong multiple-choice question when she heard someone speak. Ruby paused and turned to glance at him. It was early spring, and he sat by the window. The gentle morning light at 8 or 9 o'clock wasn't harsh. It filtered through the dense ivy on the adjacent teaching building, casting a reflection on his face. In the neighboring classroom, students were reading ancient Chinese texts with varying tones. A gentle breeze rustled the silver curtains beside him and played with the strands of hair on his forehead. She vaguely remembered the boy's name. It seemed to be Brandon. Out of courtesy, she smiled at him and replied, "Yes." The boy seemed to have just woken up. The creases from his school uniform cuffs were still imprinted on the right side of his face. He squinted his already small eyes and pulled a smile with a dimple at Ruby. This was the first conversation between 16-year-old Brandon and 16-year-old Ruby. Half a month later, even after her foot had healed, Ruby continued to falsely report her condition. Her physical fitness was not up to par, and the usual 800-meter run would almost cost her life. Compared to the eagerly anticipated physical education class, she preferred studying and doing exercises in the classroom. Generally, Brandon also stayed in the classroom. Sometimes they wouldn't exchange a word, she would study while he napped. Other times, they engaged in casual conversations that touched on every classmate entering the room. Later, their interactions increased gradually. Sometimes he would come over and ask her about some questions. Occasionally, he'd casually buy a bottle of her favorite drink. On the desk, there would occasionally be a few more pieces of candy. She earnestly explained test papers to him, quietly accepted the snacks he gave her, and didn't refute when classmates teased them as a couple. One summer day, the weather was unpredictable. The clear morning sky turned into thunderstorms by evening. Looking at the pouring rain outside the window after school, Ruby hesitated. Her father was away on a business trip, and her mother had gone back to her hometown to visit her sick uncle. There was no way to count on them for an umbrella. Just as she gritted her teeth, preparing to dash into the rain, a blue umbrella bloomed like a flower above her head. She stared in astonishment at Brandon holding the umbrella. He awkwardly handed it to her, then ran out of the teaching building in the rain, soaking his school uniform and hair. He stood there, waving to her in the rain, saying, "See you tomorrow." Ruby would later mock Brandon every time she mentioned this incident. "The umbrella was so big, why didn't you share it with me?" At that time, Brandon was lying on her lap playing a game. "Back then, I thought you weren't interested in me. I was afraid you'd dislike me if we got too close." Ruby pinched his face. "How did you determine that I was interested in you?" Brandon sat up seriously and said, "Because you cried." Ruby knew he was referring to that autumn sports day. As someone athletically challenged, she volunteered early to avoid being dragged into a competition. She maintained order at the venue, provided water to athletes, reminded them of upcoming matches, and handled various miscellaneous tasks. She didn't expect Brandon to sign up for the competition, considering that, in her opinion, those who shared her aversion to physical education naturally had some resistance to the playground. Unexpectedly, he made it through the preliminary rounds and directly reached the finals. Although he didn't win the championship, he secured third place. Unfortunately, during his forceful sprint to the finish line, he couldn't stop in time, resulting in a knee injury. Ruby rushed to help him, and the school nurse arrived, treating the wound and advising him to rest. He thanked everyone, declined others' offers to help, and only allowed Ruby to support him, claiming he needed to retrieve something from the classroom. As they walked back to the dormitory together after getting the item, Ruby remained silent. Brandon stole glances at her and noticed her teary eyes. Worried, he asked, "Ruby, what's wrong?" She didn't speak, only allowing her tears to fall more freely. Growing increasingly anxious, he asked again, "What's going on?" After a pause, he seemed to understand something and tentatively asked, "Are you worried about me?" Still not speaking, Ruby accepted the tissues he pulled from his pocket. The two remained in a wordless exchange. Finally, as if performing magic, Brandon took out a silver necklace he had just found in the classroom. His hands were sweaty, and his forehead as well, either from nervousness or something else. He nudged Ruby and, lacking confidence, asked, "Hey, Ruby, do you want to be my girlfriend?" Ruby suddenly looked up, a mixture of surprise and joy in her eyes. It was an ordinary autumn noon, with a delicate halo of light surrounding Brandon. He was filled with anticipation, earnestly looking at her, sincerity and nervousness in his eyes. Ruby's fingertips fiercely dug into her palm, her voice soft but clear as she said, "Sure." Every time they talked about Brandon's confession, Ruby would roll her eyes. "So, you really didn't know that I liked you back then? When Gavin and the others teased us, I didn't say anything. Don't you know that a girl's silence is consent?" Brandon smirked. "Why do you think Gavin and the others teased us? Why do you think I deliberately skipped PE every time? Why would I initiate conversations with you?" Then he ruffled her hair. "Actually, I had been planning this for a long time." Brandon was in the shower, and Ruby, holding the phone left in the living room, saw several messages popping up. They were from Gavin, discussing some matters related to client coordination in the company. Unfamiliar with the company's affairs, she was about to close it when a message from a contact named Taylor, labeled as the front desk, caught her attention. It was a rejected transfer, and she opened it to find that Taylor had returned the 20,000 yuan Brandon had transferred to her. Subsequent messages from Taylor followed. "I really don't need it. Thank you, Brandon. This is voluntary. Moreover, I plan to resign tomorrow. Thank you for your care over the past 2 years." Ruby had some impression of this Taylor. Brandon had mentioned her before, a front desk girl from the countryside who had come to the city of Sea alone, escaping from family pressures that wanted her to marry. At that time, Brandon's company was relatively new in the industry, and the recruitment notice clearly stated that the front desk required attractive features, an associate degree or above, proficiency in computer operation, and reception etiquette. The HR department had interviewed Taylor, and when reporting to Brandon, they casually mentioned that although Taylor didn't meet the educational requirements, she learned things quickly. Brandon had shared this with Ruby, and she thought the girl had it tough. Brandon, nodding in agreement, hired her directly. It seemed she was resigning, and Brandon probably wanted to give her a severance payment out of consideration for her difficulties, Ruby thought. Initially, she had no objections to this, but as she put down the phone, she began to feel that something was off. Brandon didn't delete chat records, but the earliest record with this tailor showed the money being transferred back. When she scrolled up, there was nothing else. And why did the severance pay from Brandon have to be transferred through his WeChat? Shouldn't it be handled by the finance department? Voluntary resignation? So, no severance pay? Putting down the phone, Ruby went to the study area where the computer was. She remembered Brandon often working in the study, with WeChat frequently in a logged-in state. It should synchronize chat records. As soon as Ruby entered the study, she saw Brandon's computer desk scattered with his casually placed items, cups, phone chargers, and such. Sighing, she absent-mindedly tidied up for him. Looking at the worn-out mouse pad, she recalled buying a few replacements and decided to get a new one. While flipping the mouse pad, she found a delicately packaged small box in the innermost drawer of the computer desk. Opening it, there was nothing inside except for 200 yuan neatly placed. Ruby looked at the 2 bills and smiled helplessly. Carefully, she placed them back in the drawer. She felt she might be overly suspicious due to the recent pregnancy and hormonal changes. Of course, Ruby remembered these 200 yuan. Every time they argued or Brandon got drunk, he would repeatedly mention this matter in her ear. Although they were not in the same city during college, it couldn't be considered a long-distance relationship because Brandon applied for leave from university in his second year to come to Ruby's city, claiming he wanted to start a business. At that time, he was studying computer science, and the internet hadn't risen as it is now. Brandon, with keen insight, smelled an opportunity. He enthusiastically shared his future work plans and the vast development space with Ruby under the dim yellow lights. He noticed a brighter gleam in Ruby's eyes. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Brandon scratched his head and asked Ruby, "What do you think of my idea?" Ruby laughed, revealing her neat and white teeth, shaking her head at Brandon. Brandon became a bit anxious and quickly asked, "Do you think this project isn't good?" No, Ruby replied. "I just wanted to say, Brandon, even though I think dropping out of school is not good for an ordinary person, and many things you said, I don't understand. But if you really want to do this, then go ahead and give it a try." Then, she solemnly patted his shoulder. "Brandon, you must work hard to make money and support me in the future." Ruby's parents were always honest and straightforward. They unanimously believed that this boy was too arrogant, with nothing but empty talk. He wasn't a suitable match for their daughter. How much savings could a sophomore student have? Brandon's initial capital for his startup came from his part-time work during the summer and some savings. Besides her essential living expenses, Ruby used all her university scholarships, summer job earnings, tutoring income, and flyer distribution money to support his entrepreneurship. It only proved that the older generation could foresee bad things in some aspects. Brandon's startup quickly encountered bottlenecks, and almost all of his funds were trapped. Bank loans were delayed, and at his poorest, he had only 500 yuan. Living in a rented house with a month's overdue rent, he endured the risk of being evicted by the landlord at any moment. Ruby's side wasn't easy either. Her family had been persuading her to break up with him for a long time, and now, hearing about Brandon's situation, her parents' determination grew firmer. Ruby faced their accusations or advice with silence. Unable to convince her, her parents, feeling helpless, coldly said, "Even raising a dog is more obedient than you. Now that you have wings, you don't need us. Whatever we say falls on deaf ears, right? Fine, since you don't want us to interfere, let that man take care of you." After that, they didn't give Ruby a penny. Brandon learned about Ruby being sick from her roommate, who said she had a cold and had been coughing for several days but refused to go to the hospital. The roommate mentioned knowing about the dispute between Ruby and her parents because of Brandon. They had pulled 200 yuan that day to get Ruby some medicine and hoped Brandon would persuade her. After all, Ruby's cough was affecting their dormitory's normal rest. After the call, Brandon had mixed feelings. He felt like he was an inadequate boyfriend, unaware of all these things happening to Ruby. That evening, he called Ruby and made plans to meet her, intending to casually discover her illness and persuade her to go to the hospital. That day, they met at a local noodle shop off campus. Ruby ordered 3 servings of the cheapest mixed noodles, priced at 5 yuan each. She insisted that Brandon have 2 portions, and when it was time to pay, Brandon stuffed his remaining 532 yuan into her bag. Holding hands, they wandered around Ruby's school. Brandon couldn't afford to treat her to a drink or coffee, nor could he afford a cheap hotel room to warm up in the dropping temperature. Brandon could tell Ruby was very happy. Her hands were cold, and she first warmed them on his neck, then slipped them into his pocket. Eventually, she held onto his fingers tightly, filled with joy. Ruby's cough was indeed quite severe. Although she tried to suppress it in front of him, Brandon noticed her efforts. Concerned for her health, he reminded her multiple times to see a doctor and buy medicine. She nodded in agreement each time. However, when she glanced at the time, she urged him to go back quickly as the dormitory had curfew, and his last bus was about to leave. He escorted her to the dormitory building and waved goodbye. Then he walked out of her school, step by step, toward the rented room he lived in. Now he was penniless, not even having enough for bus fare. The distance was 18.4 kilometers, and he walked for almost 6 hours. By the time he reached his place, it was already 3 or 4 in the morning. While searching for his keys, he discovered something in his pants pocket. He stomped his foot, and the motion sensor light in the hallway flickered to life. In the dim light, he saw 2 100-yuan bills. During their playful moments when Ruby asked him to warm her hands, she had slipped the money given to her for medicine into his pocket. Despite enduring days of high pressure, walking over a dozen kilometers, and having his self-esteem trampled upon, Brandon found himself reduced to tears like a dog, at the doorstep of his rented apartment upon seeing those 200 yuan. Ruby finally found the mouse pad and tossed the old one into the trash. She then glided the mouse on the new pad a few times, finding it comfortable. After a brief contemplation, she decided to open Brandon's WeChat on his computer. As expected, the records on the computer were complete. Ruby went through all their chat history since becoming friends, which didn't take more than 10 minutes. In the following moments, she found herself in an extremely chaotic state of mind. How should she phrase it? What to say? In summary, one sentence would suffice: Brandon had cheated. He had cheated with the same person twice. Strangely, Ruby didn't experience an emotional breakdown or hysteria. When she walked out of the study, Brandon had just come out of the bathroom. He was in a bathrobe, drying his hair in the living room. On his feet were a pair of blue slippers, the couple style Ruby had bought. Hers were in the same style, but pink. She changed her clothes in the bedroom, then went to the shoe cabinet near the living room entrance to put on shoes. Brandon, without his glasses after the shower, noticed Ruby walking towards the living room. "Ruby, are you going out?" He took a few steps forward. "Yeah," Ruby spoke calmly, "I suddenly crave plums. I'll go down to the convenience store and get some." Brandon glanced at the clock hanging in the living room. "It's already 10. It's too late, not safe. Wait for me to change, and I'll buy them for you." "No need." Ruby tied her shoelaces while standing up. "It's just downstairs. You've just showered, go dry your hair first." That night, the weather was actually good, with the sound of cicadas and a gentle breeze. Even though it was already 10 in the evening, the shops downstairs were still brightly lit. Taking a deep breath, Ruby decided not to go to the convenience store. Instead, she walked along the small path underneath the residential area. She felt like crying, yet she also felt like laughing. However, she couldn't do either. She and Brandon had been in love for 12 years, married for 4, and she was 3 months pregnant. 12 years, not 12 days or 12 months, but a whole 12 years. At the age of 28, Brandon accounted for 70% of her entire life. Then he cheated. Ruby didn't know how long she had been walking and thinking when Brandon's call came. She saw the screen showing husband light up for a moment and then darken again. Soon after, another call came. At this point, she had arrived at the entrance of the residential area. The security guard yawned and greeted her, reminding her to be safe going out so late. She managed to smile and assure him that she would. She still didn't answer the call. When the third call came, she pressed the mute button. Not long after, Gavin's call came, and she silenced her phone and put it in her bag. It seemed that Brandon had probably realized that she knew about the affair through his phone or computer. She checked into a hotel, turned off her phone, and had a restless night, dreaming of fragmented memories. The next morning, she woke up early to a flood of missed calls, voicemails, and numerous messages from Brandon on WeChat. There were also many lengthy messages attempting to explain and apologize, accompanied by various explanations about the accidental nature of the situation. Gavin had sent a slew of messages, corroborating Brandon's explanations and advising her to reply. Brandon was desperately trying to reach her. After turning on her phone, Ruby noticed a missed call from her mother. She answered, and her parents, too, were urging her to reconcile with Brandon. They downplayed Brandon's mistake, emphasizing that men usually cheat, and now that she was pregnant, they suggested she consider the bigger picture. Ruby remained silent, just as she did when her parents advised her to break up with Brandon. Upstairs in the hotel, there was a buffet restaurant. She got up early, had breakfast, ordered takeout for lunch, and had dinner at the buffet. She spent the whole day in the hotel without leaving or checking her phone. When she wasn't eating, she either lay in bed watching unfunny sitcoms on TV or slept. On the third day, when Ruby woke up, she stared at the ceiling for a while, then got ready and went to Brandon's company. Brandon wasn't at work today, but Gavin was busy inside. Gavin followed her closely, occasionally sneakily sending messages on his phone. Ruby went to the HR department, obtained Taylor's temporary address, took some photos, and left the company directly. "Ruby, let me explain." In the crowded office, Gavin had been wanting to say something but hesitated. After Ruby left the building, he chased after her, panting and trying to catch his breath. His face drooped, and his brows furrowed. "Ruby, this situation really isn't Brandon's fault. That day, we were all a bit drunk and disoriented. Originally, Taylor had some interest in Brandon, right? We were just joking around, asking her to take Brandon back to his room. But we all got too drunk and forgot about it. Then these things happened. But, Ruby, you, Brandon, and I have been friends for over 10 years. I see everything clearly. Brandon has always had you in his heart. He loves you. It was just an accidental mistake with Taylor. Maybe Taylor seduced him in the room. It's possible. Also, Ruby, I hope you can bear with me. You're 3 months pregnant, and Brandon, at the age of 30, is still quite vigorous. It's normal for us men to have physiological needs. But, Gavin raised his voice. Brandon really only has you in his heart. He truly loves you. Ruby looked at Gavin without saying a word. She really wanted to question him. Why do men like you, who know Brandon is married, still joke about him and that girl? Can a man who's truly drunk cover up infidelity? Even if that girl seduced him, who gave her the chance to seduce him? Doesn't Brandon have the right to refuse? Risking my life to give birth to our child, he sleeps with someone else during my pregnancy, and you come here to accuse me of not satisfying my husband's physiological needs and make a scene after his affair? Then, after Brandon cheats a second time while sober, you still tell me he loves me? Ruby no longer wanted to be angry. She turned away, ignoring Gavin's incessant chatter. Right now, all she wanted was to meet that girl named Taylor. Ruby had imagined scenarios of confronting a third party when she was bored. She thought the mistress would either arrogantly say, "Look at your old-looking face, no wonder your husband cheats," or softly and coquettishly say, "Sister, love doesn't follow a sequence. If he doesn't love you, I'm not the third party." She would tilt her face 45 degrees, gaze elegantly and sorrowfully at the sky, shed a tear, then slap Brandon hard, followed by another slap to the mistress. After all this, she would leave gracefully, find a secluded place, and burst into tears. As they sat on the sofa that day, Ruby earnestly talked about what would happen if Brandon cheated. When she was halfway through, Brandon looked at her with a pampering expression, laughing all the while. "Remember to find the perfect 45-degree angle. I'll measure it with a ruler when you lift your head. Make sure it's accurate." Feigning anger, she pounced on him, and they rolled into a bundle. He kissed her passionately, whispering in her ear, "Ruby, I love you. I promise you, there will never be a third party between us." How absurd. Ruby looked at the girl standing nervously in front of her, the girl who was once so anxious that she couldn't speak. With her hair neatly tied in a ponytail, her round eyes and face, white long-sleeved shirt, blue jeans, and beige canvas shoes, this was Brandon's affair partner, the receptionist at his company. Brandon wasn't bad-looking, and he was intelligent and articulate. As his business prospered, he attracted attention from various people. But Brandon always gave Ruby a sense of security. All backgrounds on his WeChat moments were her photos, and QQ was linked to her QQ. The passwords on his phone were mostly her birthdays, and his bank card password hadn't changed in years. He didn't like deleting chat records and had almost no defenses or privacy with her. Ruby was similar but rarely took the initiative to check Brandon's phone because she trusted him too much. What had Ruby gained from trusting him so much? Tears streamed down her face like a torrential flood released from a just-opened valve. The girl stepped back 2 paces, and after a while, timidly handed her a pack of tissues. Ruby took them, her eyes misty. She stared at the girl, hoping to see triumph, schadenfreude, or a smug smile in her eyes. But the girl showed none of that. She looked ashamed and at a loss. Her voice trembled. "Brandon is a good person. I'm sorry, sis, it's my fault." Ruby actually wanted to find some evidence of the girl's moral decay, not to threaten or do anything, but selfishly to exonerate Brandon. Look, this woman is promiscuous and lacks morals, that's why Brandon fell into her trap and cheated. Unfortunately, she didn't find any. Until now, she still chose to believe that Brandon wasn't entirely at fault, with the scales of her heart tilting towards him. Perhaps, she thought, she just didn't want to face Brandon's betrayal. She didn't want to admit that she had misjudged him, wasted 12 years of her youth, and was now avoiding reality. But reality had ruthlessly torn open a wound, forcing her to face it all. The girl returned the 20,000 yuan Brandon gave her, submitted her resignation, and was preparing to leave the city. The second time they had sex, it was Brandon who suggested it. If Ruby hadn't casually checked Brandon's phone the day before yesterday, she might have never known about this girl. Ruby looked up, tears still uncontrollable, streaming down her cheekbones to the side of her ears. She gasped for breath, like a dying fish. When Ruby descended the stairs from Taylor's room, she noticed Brandon smoking in the hallway. As soon as he saw her, he hurriedly extinguished the cigarette. Since Ruby's illness during her college days, she had been dealing with chronic pharyngitis. She couldn't tolerate the smell of smoke or other irritating gases, and her throat would often start swelling and hurting even before feeling discomfort. She walked ahead with her head down, and Brandon followed silently. After walking for a while without either of them speaking, Ruby finally broke the silence. "When you're free, let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau to handle the formalities." "Ruby, are you planning to divorce me?" Brandon's voice trembled. "I've been looking for you for 2 whole days. Is the first thing you say to me after seeing me that you want a divorce? You cheated, Brandon. Do you know that you cheated?" Ruby's chest felt a tightness, and she slightly raised her voice. "You slept with someone else, fell in love with someone else. What's the point of keeping you?" "Ruby, these are 2 different things." Brandon furrowed his brows gently. He looked carefully at Ruby's belly, leaning slightly towards her side. His hand reached towards her, ready to catch her in case she got too emotional and suddenly fell. He pursed his lips, thinking for a long time, seemingly searching for a way to explain that Ruby could accept. Sleeping with her and loving her are 2 different things. Besides, how could I love her? She's not as beautiful as you, and she hasn't been with me for 12 years. Ruby, you have to believe me. Even if I slept with someone else, you're still the one I love the most. So, Brandon, do I have to thank you? Thank you for choosing an affair partner who isn't wealthy, isn't attractive, and has no other intentions, not threatening my status?" Ruby breathed heavily. Her head felt like mush, yet her thoughts seemed unusually clear. "Brandon, you love me so much that even when you cheat, you carefully select your partner. Are you not sober, Brandon? We've known each other for 12 years. Don't you understand my thoughts? Don't you know my bottom line in these matters? Or do you think that I'm already pregnant, you're successful in your career, and subconsciously you're telling yourself, Ruby can't divorce me. She won't find anyone better after leaving me? So, Brandon, what mindset did you have when you slept with her? Curiosity? Seeking excitement? You often say you love me. Did you think about the person you love when you booked that room?" Ruby didn't wait for Brandon's explanation but suddenly felt her vision darken. The last memory before closing her eyes was Brandon anxiously supporting her. When she woke up, she was in the hospital. The doctor told her that her fainting was caused by accelerated blood circulation due to excessive emotional excitement, leading to insufficient blood supply to the brain. The doctor scolded her with a frown, "Your fetal condition is not stable, and you're not taking care of yourself." The blood test results just came in, showing mild anemia and a lack of trace elements. Pay attention to your meals, supplement nutrition, and maintain a happy mood. Don't get excessively happy, sad, or angry. Then, the doctor's tone became even more severe when addressing Brandon, "You're the family, and you should be more careful. In this day and age, you still manage to make a pregnant woman suffer from malnutrition." Brandon nodded quickly, escorting the doctor out of the ward before turning to Ruby and asking in a low voice, "Ruby, why didn't you mention the unstable fetal condition? I thought you were busy during that time, frequently on business trips." The doctor said to be careful, so I thought it wasn't a big deal. Just need to do more checkups, and I'm also taking medicine to stabilize the pregnancy. Thank you for your hard work, Brandon said softly. Ruby didn't say anything more, and the atmosphere fell into a strange silence. During these 2 days in the hospital, Brandon had been busy running around, unable to leave the company. He stayed in the ward handling documents, making phone calls in the corridor to avoid disturbing Ruby's rest. These days, Brandon had also lost weight. The woman in the neighboring bed smiled and struck up a conversation with Ruby. Your husband looks like someone who cares for others. Ruby smiled back without saying anything. Fainting wasn't a significant issue, but because of the unstable fetal condition, the doctor recommended Ruby stay in the hospital for a while. They used injectable medications to stabilize the pregnancy, and 1 week was considered a cycle. After a week, Ruby insisted on leaving the hospital. That night, when Ruby returned home, she first went to the room to find the marriage certificate. In these days, she received many messages, from her parents, Gavin, and some former university classmates with whom she had a good relationship. Ruby felt like she had failed in life to such an extent that everyone was speaking up for Brandon. Even the woman he had an affair with was defending him and apologizing to her. It made her appear as a domineering and unrelenting villain. She still felt like she was in a dream from the moment she learned about Brandon's affair until now. However, the remorseful Brandon standing in front of her constantly reminded her that this was not a dream. I beg you, Ruby. I've never begged anyone in my life, but I'm begging you now. Don't sentence me to death. Don't let me be beaten down. He grabbed his hair in pain, pleading with a tearful and humble tone, give me a chance. I still want to be the father of our child. There are many places we haven't visited together, many things we haven't done together. I want to be with you for many, many years. Please, Ruby, give me a chance, okay? At the end, Brandon choked up. He kept his head down, and Ruby couldn't see his expression, but tears dropped from his face onto her hand. The rational voice in Ruby's mind kept shouting, he cheated. He cheated. Do you still want him? He betrayed you. Betrayed your love. However, what flashed in her mind were the countless memories of their years together, the way he looked at her with affection, his nervousness during their first kiss, buying a house and choosing furniture together, the extra green onions he always added to their meals, the playful way he smeared cream on her face during birthdays, and now, when they went to a local eatery, Brandon waving his hand saying they could eat whatever they wanted because they had money, yet both of them still preferred the 5 yuan mixed noodles. They had so many memories. Ruby looked at her small abdomen, they still had a common child. That night, they lay in bed in the bedroom. He turned to embrace her with his arm, but Ruby quietly moved away. After a while, he silently wrapped his arm around her again. So she sat up, turned on the light, put on slippers, and unplugged the phone from the bedside table. Facing Brandon, who had already sat up, she said in a remarkably calm tone, the bedroom is a bit cramped. I'll sleep in the guest room. She seemed to see a dimmer look in Brandon's eyes. He got off the bed, tidied up the bedding a bit, and softly said, I'll sleep in the guest room. I'm afraid you won't be comfortable on that side. Ruby didn't argue further. She put down the phone, lay on the bed, and stared at the ceiling light with no intention of sleeping. The warmth from Brandon's body still lingered on the bedding beside her. Suddenly, she felt a burning pain where Brandon had touched her. She sat up, turned on the light, and the painful area appeared no different from the rest, no redness, no swelling, just a dense and throbbing pain. She went to the bathroom in the bedroom to wash that part of her skin, and it seemed to get better. After washing, she remembered that Brandon had slept on this bed, so she carefully changed all the sheets, pillowcases, and covers for the entire bed. She threw these items into the washing machine, lost in thought. Unconsciously, she poured the entire 4 pounds of laundry detergent. After doing all this, she felt that her whole body was starting to feel uncomfortable. So, she changed into a new set of clothes and took a shower. After these actions, it was already 3 or 4 in the morning, and she gradually began to feel sleepy. She had taken a few days off recently and hadn't gone to work. Brandon had gone to the company early, ordering breakfast for her in the living room. Ruby woke up around noon, heated the breakfast, took a few bites, but then started vomiting again. It was more severe than the early stages of her pregnancy, so she didn't dare to touch it anymore and threw the remaining food directly into the trash. Originally, she had no appetite at all, but for the sake of the child in her belly, Ruby made an effort to eat a bowl of noodles. Brandon came back around 6 or 7 in the evening, always punctual in returning home recently. Today, he bought some groceries and planned to cook for Ruby. Ruby didn't go out today, and the kitchen trash hadn't been cleared, so Brandon saw the discarded breakfast in the trash at a glance. His body stiffened for a moment, then he bent down to pick vegetables. Just as he was about to cut the meat, he heard Ruby's voice, "No need to cook, I have no appetite." Brandon turned around and found Ruby standing at the kitchen door, telling him. She even hesitated to approach him. He felt sad, but still smiled, washed his hands, walked over to pull her. "You don't want to eat, maybe the child wants to." Here it goes again, the pain in the areas of her body that Brandon had touched returned. Ruby struggled out of his grasp as if stung by something, then took 2 steps back. She forced a smile. "I really can't eat dinner. Just make your own." After saying that, she hurriedly returned to the bedroom. In the bathroom, she rubbed the part of her body that Brandon had touched. It took nearly 10 minutes of rubbing before she finally felt some relief from the pain. Days passed like this. The two of them lived separately, even communication was at a distance. After considering for a long time, Ruby finally opened her mouth. "Brandon, I think it's better for us to take some time apart." "Okay." Brandon lowered his head, picking at the rice in his bowl. "Coincidentally, there's something for the company in City B. I might have to stay there for half a month. But it's inconvenient for you to be alone while pregnant. I'll ask my secretary to find you a caretaker." The caretaker's name is Sadie, with a good temper and a smiling face. She takes care of Ruby wholeheartedly as per the instructions. One day, while tidying up Ruby's bedroom, Sadie asked if she wanted to put away the gift box on the dressing table that had been there for a week. Ruby was initially puzzled, but when she saw the beautifully wrapped box Sadie was holding, she realized it was the gift Brandon had left for her when he left. She fell silent for a moment, then asked Sadie to open it. Inside was a sparkling silver necklace. In a moment of déjà vu, Ruby felt like she had received a similar one a long, long time ago. She began to rummage through drawers and cabinets to find the necklace, and after a long search, she finally found the one she was looking for. It was still packaged in an ordinary box, and the white ribbon tied into a bow had turned slightly yellow over time. Over the years, she had taken it to the silver store for cleaning almost every year, wrapping it in silk. But it had become tarnished and unsightly due to oxidation. Ruby looked at the now blackened silver necklace and suddenly burst into tears. Then all the emotions began to collapse and explode, all the pain surged to her heart, and she bit her lips tightly, her body convulsing with grief. What to do? No matter what method she used, she couldn't stop it from aging. The necklace had truly been with her for too long, and it was now too old. A warm flow rushed out from her lower abdomen, and Ruby panicked. She dared not move and quickly shouted with a tearful voice to the caretaker in the living room, "Sadie, come over quickly." When Brandon arrived at the hospital on the fastest flight, Ruby had already undergone the surgery. She sat on the hospital bed, left hand attached to an four, right hand holding a glass, tears falling heavily onto the white sheets, dripping into the transparent cup emitting steam. Her lips were dry, and her face was pale. In a barely audible voice, she said, "I've done my best." She had truly done her best, for both their relationship and their child. Brandon opened his mouth, but couldn't speak. He knew that their last connection had flowed away with this child. There wasn't much to divide. Brandon only wanted the house, transferring almost all other assets, cars, and company shares to Ruby. As she packed and moved out of the home filled with shared memories, Brandon sat in the living room watching TV. Ruby only took her regularly worn clothes, leaving behind the couple's cup, couple's toothbrush, couple's pajamas, and various other paired items that they had bought together. In the spacious room, she managed to organize only 2 boxes. The moving crew hadn't arrived yet, so Ruby strained to push them from the bedroom to the living room on her own, with Brandon not offering to help. He sat on the sofa smoking, and the living room was soon filled with smoke. Ruby developed a sore throat, covering her mouth and coughing a couple of times. Just as the doorbell rang, she went straight to answer it. The mover apologized as he entered, saying, "I'm really sorry, this community is too large, and I got lost." Ruby waved it off, saying it was okay, and they could start moving now. The mover picked up a box and headed toward the elevator, while Ruby carried a bag and some miscellaneous items and followed. With not much to move, they completed the task in 2 trips. During Ruby's final check to ensure nothing was left behind, she noticed that the TV in the living room was playing the video from her wedding with Brandon. It happened to be the part where she was putting the wedding ring on Brandon. He, a big man, stood in front of many people, tears welling up in his eyes. With a microphone in one hand and tightly holding her hand with the other, his excited voice trembled as he said, "Ruby, since I met you, I've never thought about being with anyone else." Ruby glanced at the TV, her eyes inadvertently passing over Brandon. The person on the sofa only showed the right side of his profile, and he kept staring at the TV, not looking at her, not even turning his face. There was nothing more to take from this house. So, she walked towards the door, opened it, and just before crossing the threshold, she suddenly heard Brandon say, "The words I said at the wedding were actually a lie." She turned around, saw Brandon looking at her, the curtains open. It was evening, and the setting sun cast a reddish glow on the clouds. His face appeared weary, the shadow on the floor making his figure long and slender. His face had some stubble, and his eyes looked despondent. He continued, "I've actually thought about breaking up with you. The night you gave me the 200 yuan for the medical checkup, I was thinking that if my business venture failed again, I had to break up with you. I absolutely couldn't drag you down anymore." Ruby kept her head down without saying anything. After a long while, she politely and distantly nodded at Brandon, saying, "Okay." Then, she opened the door and walked out without looking back.